Good evening. We're here tonight to open a cold case. Now, the subject isn't a person, but an idea, the city itself. Our investigation is going to take us back 9,000 years to a place that is, for all intents and purposes, ground zero for our urban world.
You know, for 95% of our history as a species, we were defined by motion, by the open horizon. Çatalhöyük is where that all changed. It represents the great experiment, the moment we decided to trade that horizon for a wall. So the central question of our entire investigation is this: what really happens to the biology, the psychology, to the very soul of a nomadic primate when you lock it in a room with 8,000 strangers for more than 1,000 years? Well, the evidence we're about to present suggests the outcome was both catastrophic and utterly transformative.
So here's our plan. We'll proceed in 6 sections. First, we're going to visit the scene of the crime, so to speak. Then, we'll dive deep into the forensic evidence. We'll weigh some conflicting expert testimony, analyze the survival strategies they came up with, and finally, we'll reveal the profound biological consequences that are still echoing inside our own DNA today.
Okay, let's begin. Our investigation starts on the Konya Plain in south-central Anatolia, what is now modern-day Turkey. It's here, around 7100 BCE, that one of the world's very first urban communities was founded. And look, this wasn't some village that just slowly grew into a town. No, this was a purpose-built reality, a radical, all-in commitment to a completely new way of living.
In this experiment, it ran continuously for nearly 1,200 years. Think about that. It started with just a few families, but during its middle period, it just swelled, ballooning to a peak population that we estimate was somewhere between 3,500 and 8,000 people. Then it entered this long, slow decline and was eventually and very deliberately abandoned. This wasn't some fleeting attempt. This was a multi-generational epic.
Now this slide reveals the sheer strangeness of the blueprint. Just try to imagine this: a honeycomb of mud brick houses, all fused together, but with no ground-level doors, no windows, no streets, and no courtyards. The only way in or out was through a hole in the roof, down a ladder. All of life was lived either up on the rooftops or down inside these dimly lit, soot-filled private rooms. It was an architecture of absolute total proximity and enclosure, a world away from the open landscapes our species was built for.
Let's turn from the architecture to the occupants themselves, because the most uncompromising testimony we have doesn't come from artifacts, it comes from the bones of the people who lived and died inside this experiment. We really have to treat this section as a clinical forensic report on what the city cost the human body.
Our data, it's not based on speculation. It comes from an exhaustive, 25-year-long study of 742 individuals excavated from the site. This is the largest, most thoroughly contextualized skeletal record for this entire period in Southwest Asia. The bones, well, they tell the story.
So this table gives you a pretty clinical summary of the biological price tag of urban life. The shift to a starch-heavy diet of domesticated wheat, it caused an explosion in dental cavities, something that was incredibly rare in hunter-gatherers. Even more alarming, the crowded, unsanitary conditions, living right alongside your trash, human waste, animal pens, it created a perfect storm for disease. At its peak, almost 28% of adults showed signs of osteoperiosteitis, which is a painful infection of the bone itself. And then there's the matter of cranial trauma. A staggering 1 in 4 skulls we examined showed evidence of a serious head injury.
And to really understand the level of suffering, we have to define this condition: parodic costosis. You see this distinctive pitting, this spongy texture, especially in the skulls of children. It is the skeletal signature of chronic, severe anemia. This was almost certainly caused by 2 new factors of city life: a diet of grains, which actually inhibit iron absorption, and a massive increase in intestinal parasites from the unsanitary environment. The city was quite literally starving its children of iron. That 25% of skulls showing healed fractures, it demands its own separate investigation. And it's led to a fascinating and really critical conflict in expert testimony between the project's lead bioarchaeologist and its lead excavator. Was this city a hotbed of violence, or was something else going on entirely? On one side, you've got Clark Spencer Larsen. He points to what he believes is clear evidence of interpersonal violence. His team notes that the shape of these fractures is consistent with blows from hard, round objects. And in fact, hundreds of hardened clay balls, perfectly sized for a slingshot, have been found all over the site. For him, this is the smoking gun. But on the other side, you have Ian Hodder, the man who directed the excavation for 25 years, and he presents a compelling counter-theory. He calls it an architecture of risk. In a society where all your work happens on uneven rooftops, falls would be common. Just imagine descending a steep ladder into a dark, smoky room. That's a daily hazard. The problem is, the forensic signature of a fall can look almost identical to a blow.
The details of the trauma only make the mystery deeper. The victims weren't primarily young men, which is what you'd expect from warfare. No, they were split almost evenly between men and women, and many of these individuals show evidence of multiple, separate injuries over their lifetime, which suggests repeated events, not just a single battle. So this raises the crucial question, are we looking at endemic domestic violence, or just a life of precarious balance on the rooftops? The evidence, frankly, accommodates both interpretations. The truth might just be a dark combination of the two.
So given all this, the biological stress, the incredible crowding, the potential for violence, the real question isn't what went wrong, the real question is how on earth this society survived at all for over 1,000 years. To survive the hardware of the city, it turns out they had to invent a completely new kind of social software.
To really grasp the scale of the challenge here, we have to talk about something called the Dunbar limit. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar proposed that the human brain can really only handle about 150 stable relationships. You go beyond that, and social cohesion just starts to break down. At its peak, Çatalhöyük blew past this biological ceiling by over 5,000%. Simple kinship and face-to-face trust just weren't going to be enough to hold this society together.
The solution, it seems, required a kind of philosophical leap. And to understand it, we can actually look to the words of the 20th century philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. He argued that all ethics begins with the irreducible fact of the face of the other. Well, in Çatalhöyük, you could never escape the face of the other. Survival itself demanded a new code, an ethics born of forced proximity.
This social software seems to have had three core components. First, ritual became routinized. Instead of rare, ecstatic ceremonies, daily life was structured by frequent, repetitive, shared actions that standardized behavior and belief. Second, they developed this incredibly powerful shared symbolic vocabulary. Homes were filled with elaborate paintings and installations of bullhorns, which created a common universe of meaning that everyone understood. And third, they transcended biology. Forensic analysis of teeth from people buried together in the same grave shows they were often not biologically related. They had invented a new kind of family, what we call practical kinship, based on social bonds, not just blood.
But the consequences of this 1,200-year experiment, they weren't merely cultural. No, they were etched into our very biology. The city wasn't just a place people lived in. It became an active evolutionary force, literally reshaping our DNA.
This process is known in evolutionary biology as niche construction. It's the idea that organisms don't just passively adapt to an environment, they actively create environments that then exert new selective pressures back on them. Çatalhöyük was a profoundly new niche, a new environment, and it immediately began to select for a new kind of human.
This urban filter, it worked in several ways. The relentless assault of pathogens meant that only individuals with the most robust immune systems survived to pass on their genes. Living packed in so tightly favored individuals with lower reactive aggression and higher levels of cooperation, a process that's been called self-domestication. And as local resources like wood and game were depleted, people had to travel farther and farther. Skeletal biomechanics show that their leg bones actually change shape over the generations, adapting for greater mobility. We are, in a very real way, the biological descendants of the survivors of this 9,000-year-old filter.
And yet, after 1,150 years, the experiment ended. The city was abandoned. We shouldn't see this as a failure, though. We should see it as the closing of a chapter, a critical data point in a cold case that has profound implications for our own time. So why did they leave? There was no sign of a conquest, no obvious catastrophe. All the evidence suggests they simply reached the limits of the blueprint. The soil, the sanitation, the social friction, it just became unsustainable. The inhabitants dispersed, breaking up into smaller settlements nearby. They had tested the prototype and found it wanting, but they didn't destroy the blueprint. They just put it on the shelf. And today, humanity is building mega Çatalhöyüks on a scale that is simply unprecedented.
I mean, just to put this in perspective, the 8,000 people of Çatalhöyük shattered the Dunbar limit. Today, we have cities like Tokyo with a population of 37 million people. Sure, we've solved some of the original problems. We have sewer systems, we have modern medicine, but we have scaled the social and psychological pressures to a level that the residents of Çatalhöyük could never, ever have imagined.
And this brings us to our final question. The investigation of Çatalhöyük reveals a species that is absolutely brilliant at engineering its physical environment. But after 9,000 years of iterating on this urban blueprint, after learning to build skyscrapers and subways, the evidence of our modern world, our social polarization, our mental health crisis, our loneliness epidemic, it all forces us to ask, we have mastered the architecture of the house, but have we mastered the architecture of the human? That is the unresolved question left to us by this 9,000-year-old cold case.